They mocked her trembling hands, calling her a broken mouse who didn't belong in the ER. Dr. Thorne even laughed when she dropped a tray, humiliating her in front of the entire staff. But the laughter died instantly when a 300-pound soldier crashed through the doors, tossing security guards like rag dolls and hunting for a target. While the arrogant doctor cowered behind a cart, the mouse didn't run. Instead, Elara stepped directly into the path of the monster, unarmed and unafraid, and did the one thing no one else dared to do, proving that the only thing more dangerous than a giant in a rage is the quiet nurse standing in his way. The rain in Seattle did not fall. It hammered. It was a living, breathing entity that had swallowed the city whole, turning the skyline into a blurred watercolor of charcoal and slate. The Space Needle was nothing more than a phantom limb lost in the mist, and the streets below were slick, black rivers reflecting the fractured neon of a city hunkering down. Inside St. Jude's Hospital, the storm was a dull, rhythmic thrumming against the reinforced glass, a constant reminder of the chaos waiting just beyond the automatic doors. But for the night shift in the emergency room, the real pressure came from within. The air smelled of antiseptic, wet wool, and the sharp metallic tang of adrenaline. Elara Vance stood near the supply cart, her reflection caught in the stainless steel cabinet. She was 30 years old, but looked barely 22, with a slight, almost fragile frame that seemed to be swallowed up by her oversized blue scrubs. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy clip that always threatened to give up, strands escaping to frame a face that was pale and perpetually lowered. To the rest of the staff, she was a ghost, a background character in their high-stakes drama. She reached for a tray of sterile suture kits. Her fingers, long and slender, hovered over the metal. Then, the tremor started. It began in her wrist, a subtle vibration that traveled down to her fingertips. She bit her lip, willing her nervous system to obey, but the harder she concentrated, the worse it became. Clang. The tray slipped. Stainless steel hit the tiled floor with a sound like a gunshot, echoing through the busy bay. Instruments scattered, forceps, scissors, and needles sliding across the linoleum. The bustling noise of the ER, the beeping monitors, the squeak of rubber soles, the low murmur of consultations, died instantly. Silence, heavy and suffocating, descended upon the room. Again, the word was spoken softly, but it cut through the room with the precision of a scalpel. Dr. Julian Thorne stepped out from behind the curtain of Trauma 1. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from marble rather than born, tall, with sharp aristocratic features and hair so perfectly coiffed it seemed immune to the humidity. Thorne wore his white coat like a royal robe. He was the attending physician, a man whose brilliance was only eclipsed by his towering arrogance. He walked toward Elara, his polished shoes crunching slightly on a plastic syringe wrapper. He stopped inches from where she stood, looking down at her with eyes the color of ice. I'm sorry, doctor, Elara whispered, her voice barely audible. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the fallen tools. Her hands were still shaking. Leave it, Thorne commanded. Elara froze. Stand up, Vance. She rose slowly, clutching a handful of dirty instruments to her chest like a shield. Look at you, Thorne said, his voice loud enough for the interns and nurses at the central station to hear. He gestured at her trembling hands. You are vibrating, literally vibrating. This is a level 1 trauma center, Vance. We deal with life and death measured in seconds and millimeters. We do not have time for fragility. It was just a slip, sir. The thunder... The thunder? Thorne let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. He turned to the room, seeking an audience. Did you hear that? The thunder scared her. Perhaps we should get you a nightlight, or maybe a pacifier. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the staff. A young resident smirked behind his clipboard. They were relieved the predator's gaze wasn't fixed on them. You are a liability, Elara, Thorne said, leaning in close, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. I don't know whose heartstrings you tugged to get hired here, but you are a mouse in a den of lions. One day, a real crisis will walk through those doors, and your shaking hands are going to kill someone. Elara didn't argue. She didn't look up. She simply nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. It won't happen again, doctor. See that it doesn't. Now get out of my sight before you break something expensive. Thorne spun on his heel and marched back to his patient, the white coat billowing behind him. The show was over. The noise of the ER resumed, but the tension remained, clinging to Elara like a second skin. She deposited the soiled instruments in the biohazard bin and retreated. She didn't go to the break room to cry. She didn't go to the bathroom to splash water on her face. Instead, she moved to the shadows. In the far corner of the ER, away from the bright lights and the high-tech machinery, lay a stretcher that everyone else ignored. On it lay old Henry. Henry was a fixture of downtown Seattle, a man whose life was written in the deep crevices of his weather-beaten face and the layers of mismatched coats he refused to take off. He had been brought in for a respiratory infection, something minor enough to be deprioritized by Thorne, but serious enough to kill a man of his age living on the streets. Elara pulled a stool beside him. The transformation was instantaneous. The moment she sat down, away from Thorne's gaze, her shoulders dropped. The frantic energy dissipated. "He's a loud one, that peacock," Henry rasped, his eyes closed. His voice sounded like gravel grinding together. "He's just stressed, Henry," Elara said softly. She reached out to check his IV line. Her movements were fluid, precise, and completely steady. "How is the breathing?" "Better now that you're here." Henry opened one eye. It was milky with cataracts, but sharp with a wisdom that street life forced upon you. He reached out and took her hand. His skin was rough like sandpaper, dry and cold. Elara didn't pull away. She let him hold her hand, offering him the only warmth he had likely felt in days. Henry turned her hand over, running his thumb across her palm. He paused at the base of her index finger and the ridge of her thumb. He frowned, feeling the thick, hardened skin there. It wasn't the soft hand of a girl who had spent her life in classrooms and libraries. It was a landscape of calluses. "My father was a blacksmith," Henry whispered, looking up at her with sudden intensity. "He had hands like rocks. He told me you can read a person's soul by what their hands are used to holding." Elara tried to gently withdraw her hand, but Henry held on. "These aren't nurses' hands, Elara," he murmured. "Nurses have calluses on their feet from running. You have calluses on your trigger finger, and your grip, it's iron." Elara's heart skipped a beat. She forced a soft, deflecting smile. "I do a lot of gardening, Henry. Rakes and shovels." Henry coughed, a wet, rattling sound, but he kept his gaze locked on hers. "You can lie to the peacock and the white coat girl, but don't lie to a dying man. I saw you when the tray dropped. You didn't flinch because of the noise. You flinched because you were remembering a different kind of noise." He squeezed her hand. "You don't shake because you're scared, Elara," he whispered, revealing a truth she had buried deep. "You shake because you are holding back an avalanche. You are restraining a beast, and it takes every ounce of your strength just to stand still." Elara stared at him, her breath hitching in her throat. For a second, the mask slipped. Her eyes, usually soft and brown, hardened into something older, something ancient and pained. Before she could answer, a wet nose nudged her elbow. She looked down. It was Barnaby. Barnaby was the hospital's therapy dog, a golden retriever with fur the color of honey and eyes that seemed to understand human sorrow better than most psychiatrists. He wandered the halls freely, usually gravitating toward crying children or anxious relatives. But tonight, with the storm raging outside, Barnaby had ignored everyone. He bypassed the nurses offering treats. He ignored the weeping family in Bay 3. He padded silently across the linoleum and sat directly at Elara's feet. He pressed his heavy head onto her lap and let out a long, shuddering sigh. "Even the dog knows," Henry chuckled softly. "Animals don't like storms. They look for the strongest shelter. He didn't pick the doctor. He picked you." Elara buried her fingers in Barnaby's soft fur, scratching behind his ears. The dog leaned into her touch, grounding her. "I'm just a nurse, Henry. Just a nurse." "Vance!" The intercom barked her name, destroying the moment of peace. Elara stood up instantly. "Rest, Henry. I'll check on you in an hour." She walked back toward the central station, head down, shoulders hunched again. The mouse costume was back on. Dr. Thorne was standing by the intake desk, looking at a tablet. He didn't even look up as she approached. "Since you have so much free time to socialize with the vagrants," Thorne said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I have a new assignment for you." "Sir?" "Reception. The storm has knocked out the traffic signals on 4th Avenue. EMS is predicting a surge in walk-ins. Someone needs to man the front desk, triage the minor injuries, and keep the riffraff out of my ER." Elara looked toward the front entrance. The automatic doors were rattling in their frames. The wind howled like a banshee. It was the coldest, most exposed position in the hospital. "But, doctor?" Elara hesitated. "The triage nurse usually has to be—" "Are you arguing with me, Vance?" Thorne looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You want to be useful? Go stand watch. If anyone comes in bleeding, call a real nurse. Otherwise, have them fill out forms. Do you think you can handle paperwork without dropping it?" "Yes, sir," Elara said quietly. She turned and walked toward the double doors that separated the treatment area from the waiting room. As she passed the threshold, the hospital's main power grid flickered. Zzzzt. Darkness swallowed the room for a heartbeat. Then, the red emergency lights hummed to life, bathing the reception area in a bloody, ominous glow. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the floor. Elara took her place behind the reception desk. She looked out at the sliding glass doors. Beyond them, the world was a chaotic swirl of gray and black. The rain lashed against the glass as if trying to break in. Barnaby, the dog, had followed her. He didn't return to the warm interior. He crawled under the reception desk and curled up at Elara's feet, his body tense, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Elara felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. It wasn't the cold. It was an instinct she hadn't used in years. The spidey sense of the battlefield. The air pressure had changed. The silence between the thunderclaps felt heavy, pregnant with a threat that had no name. She placed her hand on the counter to steady herself. She wasn't shaking anymore. Something was coming. The destruction of the barrier between the raging storm outside and the sterile sanctuary of St. Jude's Hospital did not happen with a whimper, but with a catastrophic explosion of sound. One moment, Elara Vance was standing behind the reception desk, her hand resting on the cool laminate counter, watching the rain lash against the reinforced glass. The next moment, the world dissolved into a shower of diamond-sharp fragments. The automatic sliding doors didn't just malfunction. They were obliterated. A force of nature had collided with them, shattering the safety glass into a million glittering shards that skittered across the polished floor like ice on a frozen lake. The wind howled into the lobby, instantly dropping the temperature by 20 degrees. Rain swept in sideways, soaking the waiting chairs and the old magazines. But no one looked at the weather. All eyes were fixed on the figure that stepped through the jagged frame of the broken entrance. He was a titan. Silas the Bear Kincaid stood 6'10", a mountain of a man who seemed to block out the remaining light from the street lamps. He weighed over 300 pounds, not of fat, but of dense corded muscle that strained against a soaking wet, mud-caked army jacket. His pants were torn at the knees, revealing skin that was raw and bleeding. He didn't look like a patient seeking help. He looked like a survivor walking out of the apocalypse. His face was a map of violence. A thick matted beard hid his jaw, and a fresh gash above his left eyebrow leaked blood that mixed with the rain running down his cheek. But it was his eyes that terrified Elara. They were wide, frantic, and completely untethered from reality. "Extraction!" Silas roared. His voice was a baritone thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the room. "We missed the extraction window. Where is the bird?" He wasn't speaking to the terrified receptionist or the few patients huddled in the waiting room. He was shouting at ghosts. To Silas Kincaid, the fluorescent lights of the hospital lobby were the blinding flares of a night raid gone wrong. The sound of the wind was the scream of incoming mortars. He was back in the sandbox, back in the nightmare that had claimed his sanity 3 years ago. Elara didn't freeze. Her training kicked in before her conscious mind could process the threat. She saw his muscles bunch, saw the trajectory of his gaze. He was looking for cover. "Incoming!" Silas bellowed, and he charged. He didn't run around the reception desk. He went through it. Elara dropped. It wasn't a panicked collapse. It was a calculated tactical retreat. She slid under the heavy oak desk, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms over her head. Beside her, Barnaby the dog whimpered and pressed his body against her flank. Crash! The impact was deafening. Silas's massive shoulders slammed into the front of the reception counter. Wood splintered and cracked. Monitors toppled and smashed against the floor. Debris rained down around Elara's hiding spot, but the sturdy structure of the desk held just enough to protect her. From her vantage point near the floor, Elara could only see his boots. Size 15 combat boots, caked in red clay that didn't belong to the soil of Seattle. He was pacing now, turning in tight circles, panting like a dying engine. "Perimeter breached," Silas muttered, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper that was somehow scarier than his shouting. "They're inside the wire. I have to find the lieutenant." Elara held her breath. She reached out and placed a hand on Barnaby's snout to keep him quiet. The dog was trembling, but he didn't bark. He seemed to sense what the humans didn't. The intruder wasn't hunting for prey. He was hunting for safety. Suddenly, the boots stopped moving. Silas had looked up. Through the double doors leading into the main ER bay, he saw movement. Dr. Julian Thorne was walking down the central corridor, tablet in hand, barking orders at a nurse. His pristine white coat was luminous under the emergency lights. To anyone else, he looked like a doctor. But inside Silas's fractured mind, the image twisted. The white coat wasn't a symbol of healing. It was the uniform of the doctor, the faceless insurgent who had run the black site interrogation room in the basement of a ruined mosque, the man with the needles, the man with the chemical burns. A low, guttural growl rose from Silas's chest. The pain in his back, a burning, searing agony that felt like a hot poker twisted into his spine, flared up, confirming his delusion. The torturer was here. "You," Silas hissed. He ignored the reception desk. He ignored Elara, who was peeking out from the wreckage. In his mind, she was just collateral damage, part of the scenery. But the man in the white coat, he was the target. He was the source of the pain. Silas vaulted over the remains of the turnstile and sprinted toward the ER doors. "Security!" a voice screamed. 2 guards stepped into the hallway to intercept him. First was Officer Miller, a 50-year-old retired beat cop with bad knees and a weary expression. He raised a hand, his other reaching for the pepper spray on his belt. "Sir, stop right there. You need to—" He never finished the sentence. Silas didn't even slow down. He treated Miller like a swinging door. With a stiff arm shove that looked effortless, Silas caught Miller in the chest. The guard was lifted off his feet and sent flying backward, crashing into a row of metal waiting chairs with a sickening clatter. The second guard, a young man named Davis, who spent more time in the gym than on patrol, tried to tackle the giant. He lowered his shoulder and drove into Silas's midsection. It was like tackling a moving freight train. Silas didn't budge. Instead, he grabbed Davis by the back of his tactical vest and the seat of his pants. With a roar of exertion, Silas lifted the 200-pound man into the air and tossed him aside. Davis slid across the polished linoleum floor for 20 feet until he hit a wall, slumping down unconscious. The path was clear. Dr. Thorne heard the commotion and turned around. His expression of annoyance vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He saw the giant charging at him. He saw the blood. He saw the madness. "Help!" Thorne shrieked, his voice cracking an octave higher than usual. The arrogance that defined him evaporated, leaving behind a small, frightened man. Thorne dropped his tablet and ran. He scrambled backward, knocking over a tray of sterile instruments. He wasn't running toward his patients to protect them. He was running to save himself. Silas pursued, his heavy boots thudding against the floor like war drums. He wasn't fast, but he was relentless. He moved with the momentum of a landslide. "You can't hide!" Silas screamed, his voice thick with tears and rage. "Tell me where the bomb is! Tell me!" Thorne reached the end of the hallway, Trauma Bay 4. It was a dead end. To his left was a wall, to his right, a solid glass partition. He was trapped. Silas slowed down as he approached his prey. He was 10 feet away. 5 feet. Thorne grabbed the only thing between him and the monster, a heavy metal medication cart. He pulled it in front of him, cowering behind the rows of plastic drawers and vials. "Stay back!" Thorne yelled, holding up a trembling hand. "I'm a doctor! I'm a doctor!" "Liar!" Silas grabbed the front of the heavy cart. The cart was locked and weighed easily over 100 pounds. Silas ripped it aside as if it were made of cardboard, sending thousands of dollars of narcotics and adrenaline ampules crashing onto the floor. Thorne collapsed against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting in a puddle of spilled saline and shattered glass. He squeezed his eyes shut and threw his hands up to protect his face. "Please," Thorne sobbed. "I don't know who you are. Please don't kill me." Silas loomed over him. The giant's chest was heaving. He reached out, his massive hand closing into a fist. He wasn't seeing Julian Thorne, the Ivy League graduate. He was seeing the man who had broken his spirit. But he didn't strike, not yet. He looked around wildly for a weapon, something to finish the job. His eyes landed on a heavy steel IV pole standing by the bedside. Elara, having scrambled out from the wreckage of the reception desk, reached the double doors just in time to see the giant's hand close around the cold steel of the pole. She saw the fear on Thorne's face, a fear she had seen on the faces of young soldiers realizing they were about to die. The storm had fully entered the hospital, and the eye of that storm was staring down at the man who had called her a mouse. The screech of tearing metal cut through the screams in the emergency room, a sound so raw and violent it seemed to strip the nerves bare. Silas Kincaid had found his weapon. It was a heavy chrome-plated IV stand, the base weighed down with cast iron to prevent tipping. To a normal man, it was a piece of clumsy medical furniture. To Silas, in the grip of his waking nightmare, it was a pike, a club, a tool of war. He ripped it from the bedside, snapping the plastic tubing of the saline bags attached to it. Clear fluid sprayed into the air like arterial spray, mixing with the sweat and rain that dripped from his beard. "No more needles!" Silas roared, the veins in his thick neck bulging like ropes. "No more serum!" He swung the pole in a wide, testing arc. It whistled through the air, smashing into a wall-mounted monitor. Plastic shattered, sparking briefly before dying. Behind the overturned medication cart, Dr. Julian Thorne made a sound that was less human and more like the whimper of a trapped rodent. He curled into a ball, covering his head with his expensive manicured hands. The arrogance that usually armored him had dissolved, leaving behind a shivering mess of primal terror. He was not a doctor anymore. He was prey. The emergency room had descended into absolute bedlam. Nurses scrambled over counters. Interns, who just hours ago had been joking about coffee orders, were now sprinting toward the exits, their white coats flapping like flags of surrender. Patients, some with IVs still trailing from their arms, hobbled and crawled away from the epicenter of the violence. It was a stampede of fear, a collective instinct to survive that overrode duty, logic, and shame. Everyone was running away. Everyone except Elara Vance. At the ruined reception desk, time seemed to warp. The world slowed down, the chaotic noise fading into a dull, underwater hum. Elara watched the giant raise the steel pole high above his head, aiming directly at the cowering doctor. She calculated the distance, 40 feet. She calculated the time, 3 seconds. She didn't think. Thinking took time, and time was a luxury she couldn't afford. She felt. A switch in her brain, long rusted over by years of civilian life and pretending to be the mouse, suddenly flipped. The tremor in her hands vanished completely. Her breathing synced with her heart rate. She vaulted over the debris of the reception desk. She didn't run like a nurse rushing to a code blue. She ran like a soldier moving under fire. Her center of gravity was low, her steps silent and explosive. She wove through the fleeing crowd, a salmon swimming upstream against a current of panic. As she ran, the red emergency lights of the hospital hallway began to blur. The smell of floor wax and rubbing alcohol was replaced by the phantom sense of burning diesel and copper. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of the hospital's backup generator transformed in her mind. It became the rhythmic beat of a Black Hawk helicopter's rotor blades cutting through the heavy desert air. Flash. She wasn't in Seattle anymore. She was back in the sandbox. The linoleum floor was the dusty earth of a village in the Kandahar province. The rain against the windows was the pinging of shrapnel against a tin roof. "Move, Dove! Move!" A voice from her past screamed in her ear. Her old squad leader, a man who hadn't come home. "No man left behind," she whispered, the words escaping her lips like a prayer. It didn't matter that the man on the floor was Julian Thorne, a man who had mocked her, belittled her, and treated her like furniture. In this moment, he wasn't a bully. He was a civilian. He was a non-combatant in the kill zone. And Elara Vance had sworn an oath that went far deeper than the Hippocratic one. 2 seconds. Silas's muscles locked. He prepared to bring the heavy steel pole down with enough force to crush a human skull. His eyes were focused on the white coat, the symbol of his torment. Elara hit the trauma bay floor, sliding the last 5 feet on her knees. The friction burned through her scrubs, searing her skin, but she didn't flinch. She used the momentum to slide directly between the giant and the doctor. She stopped. She rose to her feet. It was a movement of impossible grace and stillness amidst the chaos. One moment, there was nothing between Thorne and death. The next moment, there was Elara. She didn't raise her hands in a defensive boxing stance. She didn't cower. She didn't scream. She simply stood there. She planted her feet shoulder-width apart, rooting herself to the ground like a tree that refuses to bow to the hurricane. She spread her arms out to her sides, not to fight, but to shield. Her small frame, barely 5'4", looked absurdly fragile against the backdrop of the 6'10" Leviathan looming over her. She was a candle standing against a tsunami. "Stop!" The word didn't come from her throat. It came from her diaphragm, projected with a command authority that shattered the air. It wasn't the voice of Elara the receptionist. It was the voice of Captain Vance. Silas froze. The heavy steel pole hung in the air, trembling in his white-knuckled grip. The momentum of his rage had hit an unexpected wall. His brain, firing wildly with adrenaline and flashbacks, couldn't process the image in front of him. The enemy was supposed to run. The enemy was supposed to fight back. The enemy was not supposed to be this. Behind Elara, Dr. Thorne slowly lowered his hands. Through the gaps between his fingers, he saw the back of her blue scrubs. He saw the way her messy hair clip was barely holding on. He saw the way her spine was straight as an arrow. He couldn't breathe. He stared at the back of her neck, expecting to see the steel pole come crashing down and break her in two. He wanted to close his eyes, but he couldn't look away. The mouse was standing in the mouth of the dragon. Elara slowly lifted her chin. Rainwater from her hair dripped onto her nose, but she didn't blink. She looked up past the torn army jacket, up past the heaving chest that was as wide as a beer keg, up into the wild, bloodshot eyes of the monster. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. Silas blinked, confused. The red haze in his vision wavered. He looked down at the small woman. In his hallucination, the landscape shifted. The doctor was gone. In his place was something else, a barrier, a checkpoint. "Move," Silas growled, his voice sounding like grinding stones. He has the codes. I have to extract the codes." "There are no codes, Sergeant," Elara said. Her voice was no longer a shout. It was calm, flat, and deadly serious. It was the tone used to talk a man off a ledge. "Target is secure. You are flagging a friendly." Silas twitched. The terminology hit him like a physical blow. Flagging a friendly. Aiming a weapon at an ally. He shook his head, fighting the fog. "No, no friendlies. Ambush. We were ambushed." He tightened his grip on the pole. The rage was swelling again, the paranoia whispering that this small woman was a trap, a trick, a child soldier with a vest strapped to her chest. "I said move!" Silas roared, raising the weapon higher, poised to strike through her to get to Thorne. Elara didn't move an inch. She didn't even flinch. She took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of his fear, the sweat, the mud, the old blood. She knew this smell. She had lived in it for 3 tours. "You will have to go through me, Marine," Elara said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "And I don't go down easy." It was a bluff, a terrifying suicidal bluff. Physically, he could snap her like a twig, but psychologically, she was betting everything on the one thing she knew about men like Silas Kincaid. They were trained to kill the enemy, but they were programmed to protect the innocent. She was gambling her life that the soldier inside him was still alive, buried somewhere beneath the rubble of his mind. But as the shadow of the steel bar fell across her face, Elara realized with a jolt of cold dread that she might be wrong. The man looking down at her wasn't seeing a friendly. He was looking at an obstacle, and obstacles were meant to be removed. The giant's muscles coiled. The pole began its descent. The steel fee pole did not fall in a straight line. It descended with the terrifying, hissing arc of a guillotine blade. To Dr. Julian Thorne, huddled on the wet floor behind the overturned cart, the movement was a blur of impending death. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the crunch of bone, the spray of blood, the end of his brilliant career in a dirty, rain-soaked ER in Seattle. But the sound never came. Elara Vance did not flinch. She did not blink. As the heavy chrome bar plummeted toward her skull, she didn't see a weapon. She saw a vector of force. She saw mass, velocity, and trajectory. Variables in an equation she had solved 1,000 times before, in the dust of Kandahar and the mud of the Arghandab Valley. She did not block the strike. To block a blow from a man of Silas Kincaid's size, fueled by hysterical strength, would have shattered her forearms like dry twigs. Instead, she invited it in. In the fraction of a second before impact, Elara exhaled. She stepped forward, not away from the danger, but into the void, closing the distance between herself and the giant. It was a movement of pure irimi, the entry technique of Aikido, entering the sphere of the attacker to neutralize the energy at its source. She pivoted on her left heel, her body turning like a door on a hinge. The steel pole missed her shoulder by a millimeter, the wind of its passage lifting stray strands of her hair. The weapon slammed into the linoleum floor with a deafening crack, chipping the tile. But Elara was already moving. She was a ghost in blue scrubs. As Silas overcommitted to the strike, his massive momentum carrying him forward, Elara reached out. She didn't grab him, she guided him. Her small hands found his wrist and his elbow. She applied the slightest pressure, a mere suggestion of direction, using his own weight against him. "Easy, big man," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her over the roar of his own blood. She spun with him, a fluid circular motion that looked less like combat and more like a macabre waltz. She used her hip as a fulcrum, guiding the 300-pound titan into the wall. Thud. Silas hit the drywall face first. It wasn't a bone-breaking impact. Elara had controlled the velocity perfectly, but it was enough to stun him, enough to rattle the red fog of his PTSD for a heartbeat. The shock of the wall against his face disrupted his equilibrium. He groaned, trying to push himself back up, trying to find the enemy. But the enemy was no longer in front of him. The enemy was a shadow clinging to his back. Elara didn't hesitate. She knew this window of opportunity was smaller than a heartbeat. She leaped. It was an impossible athletic feat for someone who, just minutes ago, had been dropping trays. She sprang onto the giant's back, her legs wrapping around his waist, her ankles locking together in a body triangle to anchor herself. She was a backpack of doom attached to a grizzly bear. Silas roared, a sound of confusion and primal rage. He bucked backward, trying to dislodge her, trying to smash her against the wall. Elara gritted her teeth, absorbing the impact as her spine hit the drywall. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but she locked it away in a mental box. She snaked her left arm around his thick, tree-trunk neck. She didn't go for the windpipe. That would cause panic, pain, and a fight to the death. She went for the sides of the neck. She slid her forearm deep, aligning the crook of her elbow with his chin. She grabbed her own bicep, forming a vise, and placed her right hand behind his head to apply forward pressure, the vascular sleeper hold. It was the most humane way to end a fight. By compressing the carotid arteries, she wasn't cutting off his air. She was restricting the blood flow to the brain. It was a dimmer switch for consciousness. "Let go!" Silas choked out, thrashing wildly. He reached up with hands the size of shovels, clawing at her arms, trying to rip her off. "Insurgents! They're on my 6!" Elara tightened the hold. She pressed her cheek against the back of his matted, wet head. She could smell the rain, the old sweat, and the metallic tang of fear coming off him. "No insurgents, Silas," she said. She didn't shout. She didn't command. She dropped her voice to a frequency that cut through the chaos, a tone she had used on terrified boys bleeding out in the back of Black Hawks. It was the voice of the dove. She leaned closer to his ear, her lips brushing the dirt on his earlobe. "The mission is over, Private," she whispered, the words rhythmic and soothing. "The extraction bird is here. We are wheels up." Silas stiffened. The thrashing slowed. The words were a key, turning a lock deep inside his fractured psyche. Wheels up. Mission over. "Lieutenant!" Silas gasped, his voice slurring as the oxygen in his brain began to dip. Is everyone safe?" "Everyone is safe," Elara lied, her voice breaking with a sudden surge of empathy. "You held the line, Kincaid. You did your job. Now stand down." The giant's legs began to wobble. The iron grip he had on her arm loosened. His hands fell to his sides. The rage drained out of him, replaced by a heavy, overwhelming exhaustion. "Time to go home," Elara murmured, maintaining the pressure just enough to guide him into the darkness. "Just sleep. No more noise. Just sleep." Silas Kincaid, the man who had tossed security guards like rag dolls, slumped. He didn't fall, he melted. Elara rode him down. As his knees buckled and he collapsed backward, she unhooked her legs and slid sideways, guiding his massive head so it wouldn't crack against the floor. It was a movement of profound tenderness. She laid him out on the cold tile as a mother would lay a child into a crib. The ER was dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the backup generator and the drumming of the rain. Thorne, still cowering behind the cart, peeked out. He watched, mouth agape, as the trembling mouse knelt over the unconscious monster. Elara didn't look at the audience. She immediately pressed 2 fingers to Silas's carotid artery. Thump, 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 strong, steady. He was out, but he was alive. "I need restraints," Elara barked. The command cracked the silence like a whip. "Now!" A stunned nurse, paralyzed by the door, finally jerked into motion. She grabbed a set of heavy-duty leather restraint straps from a crash cart and threw them to Elara. Elara caught them midair. Her hands were moving with a speed that blurred. She didn't use the standard hospital loops. She took the thick nylon straps and wound them around Silas's wrists, crossing them behind his back. Her fingers danced over the material. Loop, twist, pull, loop, twist, pull. She tied a miller's knot. It was a constrictor knot, used by farmers to tie grain sacks, but perfected by the special forces for securing high-value targets in the field. The more the prisoner struggled, the tighter the knot became. It was impossible to slip out of without dislocating a thumb. She secured his ankles next, her movements efficient, robotic, practiced. Within 20 seconds, the threat was neutralized. The giant was packaged. Elara sat back on her heels. She took a deep breath, and as the adrenaline began to recede, the reality of the room rushed back in. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in Silas's mud and a smear of his blood from the cut on his forehead. She wiped them on her scrubs. Slowly, she looked up. 50 pairs of eyes were staring at her. Nurses, patients, security guards, who were just picking themselves up off the floor. And Dr. Thorne. Thorne slowly stood up from behind the cart. He smoothed his ruined wet white coat, trying to regain some shred of dignity, but his eyes were wide, fixed on Elara with a mixture of awe and terror. He looked at the unconscious giant, then at the small woman who had dismantled him in under 15 seconds. "Vance," Thorne whispered, his voice trembling. What was that?" Elara blinked. The soldier retreated. The mouse returned. She hunched her shoulders, pulling her arms inward. She looked at the floor, her voice dropping back to its usual timid whisper. I took a self-defense class at the YWCA, doctor," she lied, though the lie was thin as paper. "The instructor was very thorough." Barnaby, the golden retriever, trotted out from under the reception desk. He walked past the stunned doctor, past the security guards, and went straight to Silas. The dog sniffed the unconscious giant's face, licked the blood from his cheek, and then lay down beside him, resting his head on Silas's chest. Even the dog knew the fight was over. The storm had broken. The adrenaline that had turned the emergency room into a battlefield began to curdle into a cold, sticky dread. The silence that followed the chaos was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the crackle of police radios and the rhythmic wheezing breaths of the unconscious giant on the floor. Blue and red lights strobed against the wet walls, mixing with the hospital's emergency crimson lighting to create a disorienting, bruised atmosphere. The sliding doors, or what was left of them, crunched under heavy boots as the authorities took control of the scene. Leading the phalanx of uniformed officers was Captain Marcus Miller. He was a man carved from granite and old leather, with a buzz cut that had gone steel gray, and eyes that had seen too much of the ugly side of Seattle. He walked with a slight limp, shrapnel from Fallujah, 2004, but his presence filled the room. He wasn't just a cop, he was a Marine, and he carried himself with the weary vigilance of a sheepdog entering a wolf's den. Miller surveyed the wreckage, the smashed reception desk, the overturned medication cart, the shattered monitors, and finally, the 300-pound behemoth trussed up on the linoleum like a Christmas turkey. "Mother of God," Miller muttered, holstering his weapon. He knelt beside Silas Kincaid. He checked the pulse at the giant's neck, just as Elara had done. Strong. Then his eyes traveled down to the man's hands. They were bound behind his back, not with handcuffs, but with heavy nylon restraint straps taken from a crash cart. Miller froze. He leaned in closer, squinting in the dim light. He traced the weave of the nylon with a calloused finger. It wasn't a granny knot. It wasn't a standard police loop. It was a complex series of friction hitches, doubled back on itself, designed to tighten with every millimeter of struggle. "A Miller's knot," the captain whispered to himself, a flicker of recognition lighting up his tired eyes. "Variation B, Ranger Standard." He stood up slowly, his knees popping, and scanned the room. His gaze skipped over the trembling interns, the weeping receptionist, and the arrogant doctor wiping slime off his coat. It landed on the small woman standing near the wall. Elara Vance looked like she was trying to disappear into the paint. She was hugging herself, her shoulders hunched, her eyes wide and wet with unshed tears. She looked like a gust of wind could knock her over. Miller walked over to her. He didn't loom. He kept his distance, respectful but probing. "Miss," Miller said, his voice gravelly but gentle, "did you tie those straps?" Elara looked up, biting her lip. I panicked, officer. I grabbed them and pulled. I didn't want him to hurt anyone else." "You panicked," Miller repeated, his tone neutral. He looked back at the knot. "That's a hell of a panic reaction, Miss Vance. Most people shake when they're scared. You tied a knot that I haven't seen since I was training with Force Recon in Quantico. You don't learn that in nursing school." I was a Girl Scout," Elara stammered, her voice pitching up into a squeak. And I watched a lot of YouTube videos on knots, for macrame." Miller stared at her. The lie was so absurd, so perfectly delivered in that wavering, fearful voice, that it almost worked. Almost. But Miller knew the look of a soldier trying to fade into the civilian background. He saw the stillness in her neck, even while her hands fluttered. "Macrame?" Miller said dryly. "Right." While Miller questioned Elara, Dr. Julian Thorne was pacing by the nursing station, nursing a bruised ego that hurt far more than his scraped knees. He watched the interaction with a burning, acidic resentment. The police captain wasn't asking him, the attending physician, for a report. He was talking to her. The mouse. The girl who dropped trays. Thorne felt a hot flush of humiliation crawl up his neck. He remembered the feeling of cowering behind the cart, sobbing, while Elara stood before the giant like a statue. He remembered the look in her eyes, not fear, but cold, hard command. She humiliated me, Thorne thought, his mind twisting the narrative to protect his fragile narcissism. She set this up. She's not a hero. She's a fraud. No nurse moves like that. She's dangerous, and she's making a fool of me in my own hospital. He needed leverage. He needed to prove that he was the alpha in the room, that he was the one in control. Silently, Thorne slipped his smartphone out of his pocket. He moved toward the unconscious Silas, pretending to check the patient's vitals. As Captain Miller turned his back to speak to another officer, Thorne snapped a high-resolution photo of the knot binding Silas's wrists. He opened his encrypted messaging app. He scrolled past his broker and his ex-wife until he found a contact saved simply as the Pentagon. It was Major Holloway, an old college roommate who had washed out of med school and found his calling in military intelligence. Thorne attached the photo and typed a quick message. Run this knot and background check on a nurse named Elara Vance. Social Security. Something is wrong. She took down a Tier 1 operator in seconds. I think she's a fugitive. He hit send. Across the room, the interrogation continued. I need to see your ID, Miss Vance, Captain Miller said, pulling out a notepad. And I need to know exactly where you were employed before St. Jude's. There's a gap in your file. I took care of my mother, Elara lied, the story slipping off her tongue with practiced ease. She had Alzheimer's, in Ohio. I was off the grid for 3 years. Ohio, Miller mused. Must be something in the water in Ohio that teaches close quarters combat. I told you it was a self-defense class at the YWCA, Elara insisted, allowing a tear to spill over her cheek. Why are you interrogating me? I saved him. Is that a crime? Miller sighed. He softened his stance. No, it's not a crime, Elara. But that man on the floor is Sergeant Silas Kincaid. He's a Silver Star recipient. He's been missing from a VA psych ward for 6 months. He's considered a weapon of mass destruction by the government. And you disarmed him, like you were folding laundry. Miller stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. I'm not here to arrest you, Vance. I'm a Marine. I know a sheepdog when I see one. If you're running from something, if you're in trouble, you can tell me. For a second, the mask slipped. Elara looked at the gray-haired captain. She saw the globe and anchor pin on his collar. She saw the genuine concern in his eyes. The temptation to tell the truth, to drop the exhausting weight of the lie, was overwhelming. She wanted to say, yes, I'm running. I'm running from the things I had to do to keep men like him alive. But before she could speak, a harsh, triumphant laugh cut through the air. She's lying, Captain. Dr. Thorne strode forward, holding his phone up like a weapon. His face was flushed with the giddy high of vindication. The ping of an incoming message had just sounded in his pocket. Don't listen to a word she says, Thorne sneered, walking right up to Miller. She's not a nurse. She's a liability. I just heard back from my contact in D.C. Elara went rigid. Her hand drifted imperceptibly toward her pocket where her car keys were. Fight or flight. Back off, Doctor, Miller warned, annoyed. This is a police investigation. It's about to be a federal one, Thorne announced, looking down his nose at Elara. I sent a photo of that knot and her name to the Department of Defense database. He looked at his phone screen, ready to read out her criminal record, ready to expose her as a fraud, a terrorist, or a violent felon. He wanted to see the fear in her eyes. He wanted to destroy her. Thorne read the message. His smirk faltered, then it vanished. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like wet chalk. The text from Major Holloway was short. It was written in all caps. File classified level 5. Black Project, Nightingale, does not exist. If you are reading this, wipe your phone and walk away. She is not a nurse. She is a ghost. Do not engage. Thorne looked up at Elara. He saw her now, really saw her. He didn't see a mouse. He saw the cold, dead stillness of a predator waiting for him to make a move. He realized, with a jolt of nausea, that the only reason he was still breathing was because she allowed it. But Julian Thorne was a man of immense, catastrophic pride. The fear was there, yes, but the humiliation was stronger. She had fooled him. She had made him look weak. And now, the government was telling him to back down? No. He wouldn't be silenced. He wouldn't be ordered around by a text message or a fake nurse. Well, Miller asked, impatient. What did your friend say? Thorne swallowed hard. He looked at the warning again. Do not engage. He locked his phone and shoved it into his pocket. A malicious, reckless smile crept back onto his face. He said she's a fraud, Thorne lied, his voice trembling with spite. He said her nursing license is forged. She's wanted for assault in 3 states. Elara's eyes narrowed. She knew he was lying. She knew exactly what that file said, because she was the one who had redacted it. Thorne was playing a dangerous game, one he didn't understand. Arrest her, Captain, Thorne demanded, pointing a manicured finger at Elara's chest. "Get this violent criminal out of my hospital before she hurts one of my patients." Miller looked from the frantic doctor to the silent nurse. He didn't buy it. But before he could make a decision, the sound of heavy engines rumbled outside. Not sirens, trucks. Heavy, armored transport trucks. "We have company," Miller said, looking toward the shattered entrance. The night was far from over. Thorne had lit a match in a room full of gasoline, and he had no idea that the explosion wouldn't just burn Elara, it would consume them all. The sound that announced the arrival of the new visitors was not the wail of a siren. It was the heavy rhythmic thrum of diesel engines, a sound that vibrated through the soles of Elara Vance's shoes and rattled the teeth of everyone in the emergency room. It was the sound of authority that did not ask for permission. Outside the shattered entrance, high-intensity floodlights cut through the Seattle rain, turning the lobby into a blinding stage of white glare and dancing shadows. Captain Miller turned toward the doors, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. "I didn't call for backup," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "I did," Dr. Julian Thorne said, stepping forward. His voice was shaky, but he lifted his chin with a desperate attempt at defiance. "I told you, Captain. The situation required specialized handling." Before Miller could respond, the night was breached. 6 figures marched through the broken glass. They did not walk like police officers who were wary of civilians. They moved with the synchronized, predatory efficiency of a wolf pack. They wore dark gray tactical uniforms, devoid of name tapes or unit patches, save for a generic military police brassard on their arms. They carried M4 carbines slung across their chests, their fingers resting casually, yet terrifyingly near the trigger guards. Leading them was Lieutenant Harrow. He was a man who looked like he had been ironed into existence. His jaw was square, his haircut was severe, and his eyes were devoid of any emotion other than procedural disdain. He scanned the room, not for people, but for threats and assets. "Secure the perimeter," Harrow barked. His voice was dry and clipped. "No one in, no one out. Isolate the target." The soldiers fanned out. They pushed past a stunned nurse, shoved a gurney out of the way, and formed a semicircle around the unconscious Silas Kincaid. Captain Miller stepped into Harrow's path. The height difference was negligible, but the weight of experience favored the older police captain. "Identify yourself, Lieutenant," Miller growled. "This is a civilian hospital, and this is my crime scene." Harrow didn't even blink. He pulled a folded document from his vest and held it up. "Lieutenant Harrow, Fort Lewis MP Detachment. Under the National Security Act, jurisdiction over Sergeant Kincaid belongs to the Department of Defense. Your crime scene is now a federal matter. Step aside, Captain." Miller looked at the paper, then at the rifles. He knew a losing battle when he saw one. He stepped back, jaw tight, his knuckles white. Dr. Thorne, emboldened by the arrival of the cavalry, scurried up to Harrow. "Lieutenant, I'm Dr. Thorne. I'm the one who contacted the Pentagon. That man," he pointed a trembling finger at Silas, "is a menace, and that woman," he swiveled to point at Elara, "is harboring him. She claims to be a nurse, but—" Harrow ignored Thorne completely. He walked past the doctor as if he were a piece of furniture and stood over Silas. He looked at the massive man bound on the floor with disdain, as if looking at a broken piece of expensive machinery. "Asset is secured," Harrow said into his shoulder radio. "Prep the transport. We're moving him to the containment unit. No sedation. We don't have time." "Wait," Elara spoke up. Her voice was small, trembling. "You can't move him. He has a head injury. He needs a CT scan. He is government property, ma'am," Harrow said, turning his cold gaze on her. "And he is AWOL. He doesn't get a hospital bed, he gets a brig." Harrow signaled his men. 2 soldiers stepped forward, reaching down to grab Silas by the arms. They weren't gentle. They grabbed the injured giant and hauled him upright, jerking his shoulders back. Pain is a powerful alarm clock. Silas Kincaid's eyes snapped open. For a second, there was only confusion. Then, the sensory overload hit him, the blinding lights, the smell of wet wool and gun oil, the feeling of rough hands grabbing him, and the guns. To Silas, the ER dissolved. He wasn't in Seattle. He was back in the cave complex in the Korangal Valley. He had been captured. These weren't MPs. They were the enemy kill team. Contact! Silas roared. The sound was primal, a shockwave that made the soldiers flinch. Despite the miller's knot binding his wrists behind his back, Silas thrashed. He twisted his massive torso, throwing one soldier off balance. He kicked out, his boot connecting with a medical cart and sending it crashing into the wall. "Subdue him!" Harrow shouted, drawing his sidearm. "Get down!" Miller yelled at the civilians, pulling a nurse to the floor. Barnaby, the golden retriever, began to bark, a deep protective sound, baring his teeth at the soldiers. Silas was hyperventilating, his chest heaving. The panic was absolute. He was trapped. He was going to die here, executed in a dark hole, and no one would ever know. The darkness was closing in, the same darkness that had swallowed him 10 years ago when the building collapsed on his squad. Then, a voice cut through the noise. "Easy, Bear! Eyes on me!" Silas froze. He swung his head around, his wild eyes searching. He knew that voice. It wasn't the voice of the small woman in scrubs standing 5 feet away. It was a sound from the deep archives of his memory. It was a melody he had held onto in the dark. 10 years ago. Syria. He had been buried under tons of concrete for 18 hours, his legs crushed, his radio dead. He was drifting into the black, ready to let go. Then, a channel had opened on the comms. A female voice, a medic from a nearby evac unit. She couldn't reach him physically, but she stayed on the line. She sang to him. She told him jokes. She promised him that she wouldn't leave. She was the reason he kept breathing until the diggers found him. He never saw her face. He only knew her call sign. The dove. Silas looked at Elara, really looked at her. He didn't see the messy hair or the oversized scrubs. He heard the timbre of her voice, the specific cadence of her command. "Dove," Silas whispered, the rage draining out of his face, replaced by a heartbreaking vulnerability. Is that you?" "It's me, Silas," Elara said, stepping forward, her hands raised. "I'm right here." "Back away, ma'am," Harrow yelled. "He is combat ineffective and hostile." Silas, confused by the shouting, jerked again, trying to move toward Elara. "Don't let them take me," he begged, tears mixing with the blood on his face. "Please, Dove, not the dark, not again." "Target is non-compliant," one of the soldiers shouted. He raised the butt of his rifle, aiming to smash it into Silas's temple to knock him out. Another soldier raised his weapon, finger tightening on the trigger. "Take him down," Harrow ordered. Time seemed to fracture. Elara saw the rifle stock rising. She saw the fear in Silas's eyes, the fear of a child, not a monster. Something inside Elara Vance broke. Or perhaps, finally, it was fixed. The mouse died. She didn't run. She launched herself. Elara dove between the soldiers and the kneeling giant. She didn't use Aikido this time. She used her body as a human shield. She stood toe-to-toe with the soldier, her chest inches from the barrel of his rifle. "Halt!" The scream didn't sound like it belonged in a hospital. It belonged on a parade deck. It was a command so sharp, so filled with absolute, unquestionable authority, that the young soldier flinched and lowered his weapon instinctively. Elara spun around to face Lieutenant Harrow. Her posture had transformed. Her spine was steel. Her chin was high. Her eyes were blazing with a fire that made the fluorescent lights look dim. "Lower your weapons!" Elara bellowed. Harrow blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me? You are interfering with a—" "I said lower them!" Elara cut him off, stepping into his personal space. She poked a finger into the center of his tactical vest, right where his heart was. "This is a medical facility, Lieutenant, not a kill box. You have a wounded veteran who is disoriented and restrained. He is not a combatant. If your men discharge a weapon in this room, you won't just face a court-martial. I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your career scraping barnacles off a cutter in the Arctic." The room went deathly silent. Captain Miller watched, his mouth slightly open. He recognized that tone. That wasn't a nurse yelling at a cop. That was an officer dressing down a subordinate. Harrow stared at her. For a moment, the bureaucrat wavered. He looked at the small woman, then at the terrified giant behind her, then at his men who were looking to him for guidance. "You have no authority here," Harrow sneered, trying to regain control. "Stand aside, or you will be detained along with the prisoner." "He is not a prisoner," Elara hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He is a patient, and until he is stabilized, the only person giving orders in this ER is me." Behind her, Silas Kincaid slumped against the wall. He watched the back of the small woman, protecting him against the guns. A smile, ghostly and faint, touched his lips. "The dove," he whispered to the floor. "The dove has wings." The confrontation in the center of the shattered emergency room had evolved into a tableau of frozen violence. Lieutenant Harrow stood with his mouth slightly ajar, his authority momentarily short-circuited by the ferocity of the small woman standing before him. The barrel of his soldier's rifle was still raised, but the finger on the trigger had relaxed, hesitating in the face of a command that felt heavier than the weapon itself. Elara Vance did not retreat. She didn't blink. The mouse was gone, buried under layers of ash and memory. In her place stood a veteran who had stared down things far worse than a bureaucratic military police officer with a god complex. "You think he's resisting because he's a criminal," Elara said, her voice low and vibrating with a suppressed fury. "You think he's a broken weapon that needs to be tossed in a scrap heap." "He attacked my men," Harrow snapped, recovering his composure, though his eyes darted nervously to the onlookers who were now filming with their phones. "He is violent and unstable." "He is in agony," Elara corrected him. She took a step back, not to yield, but to create space. With a sharp, violent motion, she grabbed the collar of her own oversized scrub top. The fabric, already strained from the struggle, tore with a loud rip. She pulled the material down over her left shoulder, exposing her upper arm and collarbone to the harsh fluorescent lights. A collective gasp went through the room. Her skin was not smooth. Running from her shoulder down to her bicep was a thick, jagged ridge of scar tissue. It was ugly, purple, and knotted, the unmistakable signature of hot metal tearing through flesh. It was a burn and a laceration combined, a souvenir from an IED that had nearly taken her arm in Aleppo. "I know what shrapnel does when it moves," Elara said, pointing to the scar. "I carry a piece of a mortar shell in my tricep. It hurts when it rains. But Silas?" She turned to the giant, who was now slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow and rapid, sweat pouring off his gray face. "Silas took a fragmentation grenade to the back during the extraction that saved my life," Elara revealed, her eyes locking onto Harrow's. "The VA missed a piece. There is a shard of metal, razor sharp, sitting right next to his pericardium. It's not PTSD that's making him thrash, Lieutenant. It's a jagged piece of steel slicing into the nerves around his spine every time he moves. He's not crazy. He's being tortured from the inside out." Harrow looked at the prisoner, then back at Elara. The certainty in her voice was absolute, but Harrow was a man of orders, not empathy. "That is a theory," Harrow said coldly, "and my orders are to transport the asset. We have medical facilities at the base. Stand aside." He stepped forward, reaching for his handcuffs. "Grab him." The soldiers moved in. "No!" Elara screamed, throwing her arms out again. "If you move him without stabilizing the object, it will puncture his heart. You will kill him before you get him to the truck." "That is a risk I am authorized to take," Harrow sneered. "Secure the prisoner." Elara braced herself. She was 5'4". The soldiers were armored giants. She couldn't fight them all, but she planted her feet, ready to be dragged away, ready to fight until they cuffed her. Then a shadow fell over her. Someone had stepped up beside her. It was Dr. Julian Thorne. The arrogant, pristine doctor looked different. His white coat was stained with dirty water and oil from the floor. His hair was a mess. But as he looked at Elara, at the scar on her shoulder, at the fierce, desperate love she had for her patient, something inside his hollow chest cracked open. He had spent his career chasing prestige, awards, and the admiration of his peers. He had belittled Elara for her trembling hands, calling her weak. Yet, here she was, standing unarmed against an assault rifle, protecting a man who could crush her, simply because it was the right thing to do. She was the doctor he had sworn to be, and he was just a man in a costume. Thorne looked at the soldiers. He looked at the terrified eyes of Silas Kincaid. The fear vanished, replaced by a strange, calm clarity. He remembered the words he had recited at his graduation. First, do no harm. Thorne took a step forward, placing his body between Elara and Lieutenant Harrow. "You heard her," Thorne said. His voice wasn't high-pitched or whiny anymore. It was deep, resonant, and backed by the weight of his title. Harrow blinked, annoyed. "Dr. Thorne, get out of the way. You wanted us here." "I was wrong," Thorne said, meeting the lieutenant's gaze. "And if you touch my patient, I will have your badge." "Your patient?" Harrow scoffed. "He is government property." "In this building," Thorne said, pointing a finger at the floor, "he is a human being under my care. I am the chief attending physician of this trauma center. My authority regarding patient safety overrides yours. If you move him against medical advice and he dies, it is not a military accident. It is manslaughter. And there are 50 witnesses here recording you." Thorne gestured to the crowd of nurses and patients holding up phones. Harrow froze. He looked around. The optics were a disaster. A heavily armed squad dragging a dying hero out of a hospital while doctors begged them to stop. It would be a PR nightmare that would end his career faster than any court-martial. "You have 5 minutes," Harrow hissed, lowering his hand. "If he is stable, we take him." "We don't need 5 minutes," Elara said, her voice tight. She was looking at Silas. "We don't have 5 minutes." Silas let out a wet, rattling gasp. His eyes rolled back in his head. His massive body convulsed once, violently, and then went horribly still. "He's coding!" Elara shouted, dropping to her knees beside him. She pressed her fingers to his neck. Nothing. No pulse. The shrapnel had moved. "Thorne, get down here!" Elara commanded. She didn't call him doctor or sir. They were in the trenches now. Thorne dropped to his knees in the puddle of water beside her. "What is it?" "Beck's triad," Elara barked, ripping Silas's shirt open, buttons flying across the room. Distended neck veins, muffled heart sounds, hypotension. The shrapnel nicked the pericardium. He's in cardiac tamponade. The sac around his heart is filling with blood. It's strangling the beat. "We need to get him to the OR, Thorne said, his hands starting to shake as he looked at the wall of muscle that was Silas's chest. "We need a thoracotomy tray." "No time!" Elara grabbed Thorne's wrist, squeezing it hard enough to bruise. "He's dead in 60 seconds if we don't relieve the pressure. We do it here. Needle decompression. Now." "Here?" Thorne paled. "On the floor? Without imaging? You have hands, don't you?" Elara stared into his eyes, her gaze piercing through his panic. "You're the best surgeon in this city, aren't you? Prove it." Thorne swallowed hard. He looked at the dying giant. He looked at the soldiers watching him, waiting for him to fail. Then he looked at Elara, whose belief in him was the only thing holding him together. "Crash cart!" Thorne roared, snapping his fingers at a nurse. "Get me an 18-gauge spinal needle and a 50cc syringe. Stat!" The nurse scrambled. Within seconds, the tray was on the floor. Elara poured a bottle of betadine over Silas's chest, the brown liquid mixing with the rain and blood. "I'll guide the ultrasound," she said, grabbing the portable probe. "You drive the needle." "There's too much interference," Thorne muttered, sweat dripping from his nose as he positioned the long, terrifying needle below Silas's ribcage. "I can't see the apex." "Trust your hands, Julian," Elara whispered, using his first name for the first time. "Subxiphoid approach. Aim for the left shoulder, 45-degree angle." Thorne took a breath. He steadied his hand. The tremor that had plagued Elara was gone from her. She was a rock. He borrowed her strength. He pushed the needle in. Silas's body jerked. "Deeper," Elara commanded, watching the faint flutter on the portable monitor. "You're hitting the muscle. Go through it." "If I miss, I hit the ventricle," Thorne whispered, terror edging his voice. "You won't miss," Elara said. "I've got you." Thorne pushed. A sickening pop sensation traveled up his arm as the needle punched through the tough pericardial sac. Elara pulled back on the syringe plunger. Dark, non-clotted blood rushed into the barrel. "I'm in," Thorne gasped, his eyes widening. "Draw it off," Elara ordered. "Keep drawing." Thorne filled the syringe. He disconnected it, emptied it onto the floor, and reconnected it. He did it again. Silence stretched in the room, tight as a piano wire. The soldiers lowered their rifles completely, watching the surgery unfold at their boots. Even Lieutenant Harrow looked pale. After the third syringe, a sound broke the silence. Beep! The portable monitor picked up a rhythm. Beep! Beep! Silas took a sudden, massive gasp of air. His back arched off the floor, his lungs expanding as the pressure on his heart released. Sinus rhythm, Elara breathed, slumping back against the wall. He's back. Thorne pulled the needle out and secured the site. He sat back on his heels, staring at his blood-covered hands. He was shaking now, but it was the good kind of shaking, the kind that comes after a miracle. He looked at Elara. She was exhausted, wet and bleeding from her arm, but she was smiling at him. "Nice work, Doc," she whispered. Thorne let out a laugh that sounded half like a sob. He looked up at Lieutenant Harrow. "He is stable," Thorne said, his voice ringing with a newfound steel. "And he is staying here. If you want him, you'll have to wait until I say he's ready to walk out. Now, get your men out of my ER." Harrow looked at the doctor, then at the nurse, and finally at the resurrected giant. He knew he had lost. The room, the world, was on their side. "Fall back," Harrow grunted into his radio, turning on his heel. "We'll wait outside." As the soldiers filed out, the ER erupted into applause. But Elara didn't hear it. She only had eyes for Silas, whose breathing was slowly returning to the rhythm of sleep. The most beautiful sound in the world was not a symphony, nor was it the silence of a ceasefire. For Elara Vance and Dr. Julian Thorne, kneeling in the wreckage of the St. Jude emergency room, the most beautiful sound was the rhythmic, persistent beep, beep, beep of the portable cardiac monitor. It was the music of a second chance. Silas Kincaid lay on the floor, his massive chest rising and falling with a steady cadence. The gray pallor of death had receded, replaced by the faint flush of life. The 18-gauge needle, still protruding from his chest, was the only thing anchoring him to this world, a fragile bridge built by trembling hands that had found their strength when it mattered most. Elara slumped back against the triage desk, wiping a mixture of sweat and betadine from her forehead with the back of her wrist. Her adrenaline crashed, leaving her limbs feeling heavy, like they were filled with lead shot. Dr. Thorne sat opposite her. He looked nothing like the pristine, arrogant deity who had started the shift. His white coat was ruined, stained with the fluids of the battlefield surgery they had just performed. His hair was plastered to his skull. But as he looked at the monitor, a smile broke across his face, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. "We got him," Thorne whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "We actually got him." "You got him, Julian," Elara said softly, her voice raspy. "That was a perfect stick, 1 inch to the left, and we would be having a very different conversation." Above them, the shadow of authority shifted. Lieutenant Harrow stepped forward. The hostility that had defined his posture for the last hour was gone, replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. He looked at the giant on the floor, then at the small nurse and the disheveled doctor. "Is he—" Harrow didn't finish the sentence. "He is stable," Thorne answered, finding his footing as he stood up. "The pressure on the heart is relieved, but the shrapnel is still there. He needs a cardiothoracic surgeon, not a jail cell." Harrow nodded slowly. He adjusted his tactical vest, looking uncomfortable. The rulebook in his head was warring with what he had just witnessed. He had seen a woman stand in front of a rifle. He had seen a doctor risk his license to save a life on a dirty floor. "If I take him now," Harrow said, his voice low, "the paperwork says he is a fugitive. He goes to the brig. He faces a court-martial for the assault." Elara stood up. She swayed slightly, and Thorne instinctively reached out to steady her elbow. "And if you leave him?" Elara asked, looking Harrow in the eye. Harrow looked at her scar, still exposed on her shoulder. He looked at the way she held herself, not like a subordinate, but like an equal. He realized he wasn't looking at a nurse. He was looking at an officer who had served in a hell he had only read about in reports. "If I leave him," Harrow said carefully, "then the report will state that the asset was found in a critical medical state. It will state that due to life-threatening complications, he was remanded to the nearest specialized care facility for indefinite treatment. A medical hold pauses all legal proceedings." He paused, looking at his men who were waiting by the door. "Soldiers don't arrest heroes, ma'am," Harrow said softly. We bring them home." He snapped his heels together and offered a crisp, sharp salute. It wasn't directed at Thorne. It was directed at Elara. "We will escort the ambulance to the VA hospital," Harrow commanded his team. "Let's move out." As the soldiers filed out, the tension in the room finally broke. The nurses and staff, who had been holding their breath, erupted into quiet murmurs of relief. But the night wasn't over for Julian Thorne. An hour later, after Silas had been carefully loaded onto a gurney and transported to the Veterans Affairs Specialized Unit, Thorne walked into the hospital's security control room. The security guard, a young man named Dave, who was still nursing a bruised shoulder from Silas's earlier rampage, looked up. "Dr. Thorne, everything okay?" "I need to see the footage from the last 2 hours," Thorne said, his voice flat. "Camera 4 and Camera 5, the main lobby and the ER bay." "Sure, Doc. The police already asked for a copy, but I haven't burned it yet." Thorne leaned over the console. He watched the playback. He saw the moment the giant crashed through the door. He saw himself cowering behind the cart, a moment of shame he knew he would carry for a long time. And then he saw the dance. He watched Elara move on the screen. It was even more terrifying in high definition. The way she redirected the giant's force, the speed of the takedown, the lethal precision of the chokehold. It was undeniable proof that Elara Vance was not who she said she was. If this footage got out, if it went to the news or back to the Pentagon, her quiet life was over. The ghost would be hunted again. Thorne's finger hovered over the keyboard. "Dave," Thorne said, "did you know that the storm caused a power surge in the server room?" "It did?" Dave asked, confused. "I didn't get an alert." "It definitely did," Thorne said. "It corrupted the files from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. A terrible tragedy. All that evidence, gone." With a decisive tap, Thorne hit the delete key. Then he navigated to the backup folder and wiped that too. The screen went black. "Oh," Dave said, eyes widening as he realized what the doctor had just done. He looked at Thorne, then nodded slowly. "Right, the power surge. I'll put it in the log, Doctor." Thorne patted the guard on the shoulder. "Good man." The storm broke just before dawn. It didn't taper off. It simply vanished, leaving behind a sky that was scrubbed clean. The sun rose over Seattle, turning the wet streets into rivers of gold. The air smelled of ozone, pine, and new beginnings. 3 days had passed since the incident. Elara stood by the window of the break room, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. She watched the city wake up. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel the urge to run. She didn't feel the phantom itch of the target on her back. "Package for you, Vance." Elara turned. Dr. Thorne was standing in the doorway. He looked tired, but his white coat was crisp again, and his hair was perfect. But the sneer was gone. He handed her a small brown envelope. "It came from the VA," Thorne said. "I checked on him this morning. The cardiothoracic team got the shrapnel out. He's awake. He's asking for pudding." Elara smiled. "He always liked the chocolate ones." "I know," Thorne grinned. "I bought him a case." He lingered for a moment, looking at her. "By the way, there was a glitch with the security cameras the other night. The footage of the fight, it's gone. Irretrievable." Elara froze. She looked at Thorne, searching his face. She saw the unspoken promise in his eyes. He knew her secret, and he had buried it deep. "Thank you, Julian," she whispered. "No." Thorne shook his head. "Thank you? You taught me that a doctor's hands are for healing, but sometimes they have to be strong enough to hold the line." He turned and walked away, back to his rounds. He was still the boss, still a bit vain, but he was no longer an enemy. He was a shield. Elara opened the envelope. Inside, wrapped in a piece of lined notebook paper, was a small object. It was a silver pin, tarnished with age and use. It was shaped like a dove in flight, its wings spread wide, the unofficial insignia of the covert extraction unit she had led a lifetime ago. There was a note, scrawled in handwriting that was shaky but large and bold. "To the angel who held the line when I couldn't. The dark is gone now. Use your wings." Bare, Elara held the silver dove in her palm. The metal was cool against her skin. She looked down at her hand. She held it out in front of her, suspended in the shaft of morning sunlight, streaming through the window. She waited for the tremor. She waited for the familiar vibration of fear and restraint that had defined her existence since Aleppo. Her fingers were still. Her hand was as steady as a rock. Barnaby, the golden retriever, trotted into the break room, his tail wagging. He nudged her leg, looking for a scratch. Elara knelt down and pinned the silver dove onto her scrub top, right over her heart. "Come on, Barnaby," she said, her voice clear and light. "We have rounds to do." Elara Vance walked out of the break room and into the light. She wasn't just a nurse. She wasn't just a ghost. She was the dove, and for the first time in a long time, she was finally home. This story reminds us that true strength is not about how loud you can roar or how hard you can hit. True strength is the courage to stand your ground when everyone else runs away. Elara Vance was invisible to the world, a trembling nurse that everyone overlooked and mocked. But when the darkness came, she was the only light in the room. In your own daily life, remember this. Do not judge the quiet ones. Do not despise the shaking hands. You never know what battles people are fighting in silence. Be kind to the stranger in the corner, and be patient with the ones who seem weak. You never know which mouse might actually be a lion waiting to save you. If Elara's bravery touched your heart today, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps us share these powerful stories with more people who need hope. If you haven't joined our family yet, please click subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a chapter of these untold legends. Heavenly Father, we lift up everyone listening to this voice right now. We ask that you wrap your arms around them in their time of need. Heal the wounds that no one else can see. Give them the strength of a soldier and the gentle heart of a healer. Remind them that even in the fiercest storm, they are never truly alone. If you believe that God places angels in our path just when we need them most, write Amen in the comments to claim this blessing today. Stay safe, and God bless you.